For our COBT viewers and listeners, it's Maynard, Mike, and Arjun here with something exceptional. For many years, we have heard about Premier Danielle Smith of Alberta. As you know, Canada is a place we're very interested in, very excited about. We think it has so much potential. And so we're so lucky today that she has joined us, and we're going to talk about what's happening in Canada, what might happen in Canada, all the recent developments in Canada, and of course, Canada's energy future and all of its potential. So let me just pause and say, Premier Smith, we're just delighted to have you. We're super excited about this.
Well, thank you. It's nice to talk with you.
All right. Well, Mike, what would you tell Arjun, me, and Premier Smith about the world before we jump in?
Yeah, we're going to make it short and sweet today. I'd say, today markets are down a little bit because, and it's really crazy because CPI came out today a little bit less than people expect. And I would have thought that would have rallied the bond market and the equity markets, but it hasn't. PPI comes out tomorrow. We'll see if that's benign as well. But I think it's going to go a long way to determine whether the Fed is going to, lower rates at the July 30th meeting or the September meeting. The way bonds are acting, it seems like September is going to be the date that they lower rates. So that's point number one. Point number two, on crude oil prices, they're down a couple bucks here in the last couple days. I think a lot of that's just a sell the news event. Remember last week we were going into Friday, Saturday, talking about basically 500% tariffs on Russian type oil, and it looks like that's been pushed aside. It's more like 100% tariffs, but that's after 50 days. So, we'll see how that develops. And it's just sort of a sell the news event there. From the standpoint of basically energy markets, key date is going to be Friday. SLB is going to report their Q2 results. The following week, you're going to have Halliburton, Baker, and a couple, pressure pumpers, stuff like that. A lot of oil service companies are going to be reporting earnings. They're not going to be good, right? I mean, oil rig count is down about 10% over the last 3 months. So, earnings estimates are going lower, but that is total consensus. But so what we're going to want to hear there is, what these companies are saying, what they're hearing from the E&P customers, because it's going to be really important to see where 25 is going to basically shake out and how we enter 2026. And one last thing, to make it quick, is I want to kind of compare some Canadian versus U.S. stats. Over the last 2 years, the U.S. and Canadian markets are kind of up similarly on a total return basis. Obviously, the Canadian market has more of a yield basis than the U.S. market. And over the last 3 years, it's not similar, but it's pretty close. You wouldn't have expected that given the big tech push that we've had in this country. From the standpoint of U.S. market cap, 55 trillion. Canadian market cap, 5 trillion. So roughly 10 times the size of the market. Now, this is what's interesting to me and what we want to talk to the Premier about. U.S. energy is 3% weighting in the S&P 500. Canadian energy is 16% of Toronto Stock Exchange. Utilities in the U.S. are 2.5% weighting, in Canada they're 4%, and materials in the U.S. are 2% weighting, in Canada they're 14%. So if you put energy, utilities, materials together, they're all critical components of AI and just growth, right? They're 7.5% weighting in the U.S. market. They're roughly 35% weighting in the Canadian market. So I think the point is that it is really, really critical we get policy, correct on both the energy and the electricity, not only in the U.S., but also in Canada. So we'll hand that back to you.
That's great, Mike. Thanks. Arjun, what would you throw in before we talk to the Premier?
I'm going to build upon some of Mike's comments. And I think people have heard this before, but it bears repeating given our guest today. We absolutely love Canadian oil and gas for two main reasons. First, when you look at the leading companies, returns on capital, free cash flow, they are as good as any company or any subsector out there. Secondly, you generally have long-lived resources, not just oil sands, but also other oil opportunities and natural gas. And at a time, there are some inventory concerns amongst some of the U.S. companies, including some of the leading ones. You don't have that issue in Canada. The world absolutely needs more Canadian oil and gas. It is good oil and gas. Canada has strict labor laws. They have strict environmental laws. And it always baffles me why those who even are in the environmental or climate community don't count that. We can have a separate debate about Scope 1 emissions, and I don't know if we're going to get to that with the Premier or not, but certainly in every other metric, this is good oil and gas. I think the final point we just make is it is critical that the U.S. and Canada partner on oil and gas. Our companies benefit from using Canadian heavy oil, especially in refineries. We end up exporting a lot of light sweet crude oil. And the question isn't, how can the U.S. be independent of every other country in the world? I'd actually argue we should be looking to partner with Canada and figure out where does it make sense to collaborate on infrastructure? How do we ensure both countries are maximizing the remaining oil and gas opportunity. And I'm hoping with the Premier we'll be able to get into some of these points in a moment. Thank you. Back to you, Maynard.
Premier Smith, one thing that Arjun often talks about is that you talk about is the billion, the 5+ billion people. Arjun's number is 7, but the people in the world that need more energy and what that means for the U.S. and Canada.
Yeah, I found that over the last couple of years that that OPEC and the framing of its members has really focused in on that issue of global poverty, which is very much in sync with how I've looked at the world. I know that there are some organizations that do backcasting where they sort of identify where they'd like to see oil production in 2050, and then they work backwards to see how much we'd have to reduce it today. But I prefer the approach that I've seen OPEC take, where it's what is realistic, what would the increase in barrels need to be, looking at all of the other sources of energy in order to be able to bring people out of poverty. And when you look at their numbers, they're now, I think, with their most recent meeting, projecting a need for 125 million barrels a day by 2050. So we're about, 104 million barrels a day today. And so I think that is something we have to be mindful of, because to achieve that production level, you do have to have more investment. I think they're talking about some $18 trillion worth of investment to be able to keep up not only with decline rates, but then also to grow to meet that demand. And it makes a big difference. And that's why we have to be accurate about it. But I think that we really do, from an interest of equity, we've got to make sure that we're bringing people along so that they can enjoy the same standard of living that we have.
Well, you're touching on something that's been very interesting to us over the last few years, which is the way in which long-term energy forecasts have become, they've diverged, and often they're influenced by what perhaps governments hope might happen, as opposed to being just realistic best guesses that people can actually use to plan around. Hopefully governments, hopefully we get away from all that politicization of our forecasts.
Well, I think we have to, in the interest of our people. When you look at what has happened in the last couple of years of energy uncertainty, whether it's in Europe or whether the impact that it's had in North America, increase in gasoline prices and diesel prices and home heating prices and power prices, and uncertainty about where supply is going to come from, and grid failures, and having to turn coal plants back on because of an uncertainty in supply. If you get it wrong, we've seen a micro version of what happens. If we fail in investing now and we underinvest, where would we find ourselves 10 or 15 or 20 years from now? That's what I think we have to be mindful of, is that we've got to have realistic forecasts, look at what's happening in the real world, obviously support all of the different options for energy, but not be unrealistic in what role oil and natural gas are going to play in the future, which I think is going to continue to be significant.
I know this is a hard question, and I don't want to take us off down, a hard to recover, to get back to the conversation type question. But Mike touched on it with his stats. Energy is so important in Canada. It's such an important part of the country, and broadly defined, it's just even that much more important. How did a country where energy is so important, it's striking that the policies crept in that have so limited energy, and how we got here. I know we're all hopeful that things will start changing back in a better direction, but it's, as an American, and you replay the last 5 to 7 years, and you look at some of the decisions and some of the policies, and you kind of go, wow, the country was restricting itself, and it's really hurt Canada. How do you think about that?
Well, I can see why it turned out this way, because if you look at the endowment that our various provinces, our subnational governments have for energy, Quebec is mostly hydro. Ontario is mostly hydro and nuclear. I think it's 60% nuclear. Manitoba is hydro. British Columbia is hydro. And our Atlantic provinces have been a bit of a mix. But it really is Alberta that has the lion's share of the endowment of oil and gas. We just did a reserve update, 1.8 trillion barrels of oil in place, of which about 165 billion are recoverable at today's technology. 1.36 quadrillion cubic feet of gas, of which about 144 trillion are recoverable at today's technology. And so that puts us a little bit standing alone when it comes to policy. But the good news about Canada is that it's the subnational level of government that owns most of the resource and has the right to develop most of the resource. The federal government has been, in the last 10 years, doing everything it can to make that more difficult, to try to achieve unrealistic national aspirations and international aspirations. But I think there's been a shakeup. I think because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the uncertainty in the Middle East, and the election of a U.S. president who has taken a more hostile stance towards Canada when it comes to our trade negotiations, that's caused Canada to say, wait a minute, maybe we need to look at this differently. And so I think things have begun to change in the last 6 or 7 months. But I think it's a healthy change. I think that everybody was galloping towards this idea that you could just build out wind and solar and batteries and fuel a modern industrialized economy. And I think that there's been a lot of really good work, even including by some of the leftist documentary makers like Michael Moore and his, I think he called it Planet of the Humans or something, where he really exposed the fact that was just not going to be possible. So we have to have a realistic conversation. And I think we had some pretty unrealistic politicians in Canada at the federal level. Maybe we've got a few more pragmatists now, but we'll see in the coming months if that's the case.
What would you say? We happened to be up in Calgary last week for Stampede. It was beautiful, and it's always fun to see our friends up there. There were some announcements. Mark Carney was in town. Tim Hodson was talking about some things. What would you say? I guess it feels like people are hopeful that change is coming and some better things are being said. What would you say about the current state of the discussion of change in energy in Canada?
One of the big things that I would say is we've got a bill that's passed that I think is very similar to what U.S. Secretary of the Interior Doug Burgum is trying to do with his Energy Dominance Council. It's recognizing that there's, 10 or more agencies that all have a piece of the approval process, and it's bottlenecked any decision making. And so to bring that together, all of the agencies charged with saying no and tell them, okay, your job is now to figure out a way to get to yes. That's the sense of what I think the Prime Minister here is trying to replicate with his national projects list. I think that there has been so much investment that has been chased away. I mean, we talk about a number of $500 billion, and it's probably that and then some when you look at the oil pipelines that were canceled, the LNG projects that were canceled, the oil sands mining projects that were canceled, the multitude of mines for critical minerals and other things that got canceled. And so you have to do something pretty dramatic to send a message to the international community, come back. And so that's what I think his national projects list is all about, is if you can get 2 years to yes through regulatory process and start building things with the private sector, then that will just continue to increase your credibility. It's not going to be, it's a necessary condition, but not a sufficient one. He still has to eliminate all of the terrible policies that chase the investment away in the first place. On pipelines in particular, we have a bill that has created such a convoluted regulatory process. It was dubbed the No More Pipelines Law because there was no pathway to get to yes. We still have a tanker ban off our west coast for our bitumen products. They are still actively talking about an emissions cap, an aggressive emissions cap, which the only way to achieve it by 2030 or 2035 would be to cap production. They still have laws about a net zero power grid by 2035, which would be impossible in Canada. And remember, when you put these laws in place, they use their criminal code power. So it's criminal sanction. If you don't reach these targets, you could have CEOs being put in prison. So there's no board of directors on the planet that is going to make a decision that could potentially expose their chief executives to that kind of punitive measure. So that's why I'm encouraged by the fact that we're going to have a national projects list. But in order to truly change the investment climate, they've got to get rid of the terrible laws that were passed in the first place that created such a chill on investment.
In the U.S., there's some similar dynamics here where things are trying to get permitted. We're trying to get pipelines built. All these, as I say, it's a similar drumbeat. And a lot of the time down here, we'll hear That's great that the administration is trying to push some of this stuff, but we really need legislative, permanent changes so that people really feel comfortable in committing to these investments. Is there a similar dynamic in Canada, which is if the federal government will back some of these things, people still might not do them for fear that, well, it gets changed, or it's not permanent, or what's sort of the structure of all this that you think is necessary to get people truly comfortable to make these big investments?
I think it's a similar dynamic, maybe more so in America, because you can change governments so frequently. You could begin with where you are right now, where you've got your Senate and House of Representatives, and White House, all the same. And then in 18 months, it might be completely different. And then in another 2 years, you might end up again with a complete shuffle of the deck. And so if you can change government and direction every 2 years, what you need is some certainty that a process for approvals, because even when you're thinking through from conception to raising money to engineering to shovels in the ground, most projects are still, even if they're moving at lightning speed, are probably in the 4 to 5 year range. And so you need to make sure that even if there is a change of government, change of ultimate decision makers, that those processes aren't going to get derailed. I mean, we fell victim to that. We thought we were going to have a Keystone XL pipeline built that would have got the largest production of heavy oil, connected with the largest refining capacity of heavy oil in the Texas Gulf Coast. And the 5 minutes after President Biden got elected, he rescinded the presidential permit. So we've seen how dramatically you can have a single person impact multi-billion-dollar investment decisions. And so I'm supportive of the Americans going down that path. I'm glad it's having a similar impact here. Ours is a little bit different. Again, because I think of the decentralized nature and ownership structure of resources, that the danger that you have here is that even if you do have a 4-year federal government, you could end up with provincial governments change. And if you're trying to do linear projects across multiple jurisdictions, that can create uncertainty. We also have a very advanced reconciliation with our Indigenous bands as well. I'm not sure if it's quite as developed as in the US as it is up here, but ensuring that you've got Indigenous consultation and buy-in, in some cases literal, so that they own an equity stake of the projects that you're talking about. That's a new development, but an important one. And so that's why I think being able to get a consensus, so whether in our environment you're a liberal or a New Democrat or a conservative, if there's something that changes, everybody agrees we've got to get things built, then I think that is what is going to be necessary to give the confidence to the investment community. And I think America's seeing the exact same dynamic.
Yeah, Premier, we talked about a third of basically the market cap of Canada is reliant upon energy materials and electricity, much more so in the U.S., but it really feels like, take for example today, the president's in Pennsylvania basically talking about this new industrial revolution that's going to happen in Pennsylvania with AI and oil and gas and all this all working together. And it feels like certain countries around the world are moving at light speed to dominate basically the AI space and powering that AI space. I want to get a sense from you of what the urgency right now is in Canada, because I sense, with the power you have, the energy you have, that this is a perfect market to basically grow the AI. I mean, so what is the sort of, how aggressive is Carney being right now? Is it too early to tell that? I mean, what are investors expecting, and what are you expecting?
I got elected in October of 2022, and AI data centers weren't even on our radar for discussion. And then last Stampede, so 2024, everywhere I went, everyone was talking about AI data centers. So we put a working group together to see what it is that we would need to do to accelerate those projects and send a message out to the world. Hey, we're here. We've got cheap gas, so you can make cheap electricity. We've got lots of land. We've got a cool climate. So that helps with keeping the cost down, because we can use nature to cool the plants down each year. We've got water. And we've got a regulatory process that we believe can rapidly approve these types of installations. And so we ended up with about 17,000 megawatts of proposals coming in for AI data centers. Keep in mind, at our peak right now, we use and produce about 12,500 megawatts of power. So we're talking about 100% and then some, just for AI data centers. And so our proposal has been bring your own power, use it first to fuel your data center, and then if you've got any extra, sell it to us, and we'll build transmission infrastructure so you could do that. So I would say that there's a very strong sense of urgency. We're seeing it all around the world. I think that our proximity to the U.S. Makes it an advantage. I think that there are also international countries that are looking for sovereign compute and being able to have that data ownership that I think also gives us an advantage as well. And so I would say that it went from zero to 100 very, very quickly over a very short period of time. And we're hoping that we'll be able to take advantage of that. I think that President Donald Trump has been very focused on this as well. Every time I see Secretary Burgum speak, I think I hear him talk about winning the AI data race almost more than I hear him talk about energy. And so you can tell that is very much on the administration's mind, is that if we're in a competition to manufacture intelligence with China, we want America to be the one that wins that. And we want to be able to support that as well as an ally of America. Because I don't know what the world would look like if China won that instead of the free and democratic nations of the world, but I don't want to find out. So I think that is probably what has seized the administration and got everybody else very interested in it. It's not just about another part of developing the economy. It really is the sort of this next geopolitical battle that I think we need to win, and it's wrapped into security issues as well.
Premier Smith, it's really an honor and a pleasure to get this opportunity to speak with you. And you mentioned in some of your remarks about the importance and the desire to show that Canada's open for business again after maybe a little bit of a stretch where that was called into question. And it leads me to my question about Prime Minister Carney, where at Veriton and Super Spiked, which is a blog I write, we spent a lot of time in the previous couple of years concerned about an organization called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ for short, which sought to essentially limit financing to fossil fuel companies and shift that financing into renewables and battery and those types of companies. It was spearheaded by Mr. Carney, and amongst its tenets that was adopted by a number of banks was there should not be investment into Arctic or oil sands, which to me de facto meant Alaska and Canada. And I just couldn't understand in this world we live in, even if you were against oil and gas, as some people are, why you would start with Alaska and Canada as the places that should be off limits. When I think about how attractive, especially the province of Alberta is, the labor laws you have, the environmental laws you have, and so forth. So my question is really, people can change. Mr. Carney was not Prime Minister of Canada before. He has a financial sector and Goldman Sachs background that Maynard and I and a few others share. So we're open-minded to this, but could you talk about what might give you confidence, or where there are opportunities to work with the Prime Minister and work with the federal government? Because I think investors hear you speak and they like you and they feel good about what you bring to Alberta. But the concern is that, will the federal government be there to help assist in ensuring some of these export and other infrastructure projects can happen? So any color you can provide on the evolution of Mr. Carney or what might give you confidence would be appreciated.
Well, let me start off by saying why your concern is valid and validated based on what we've experienced in our history. We used to, in Alberta, be able to conceive of a pipeline project, put it through the regulatory process, and get it approved. And I think that we just assumed that was going to be so obvious that people needed this absolutely essential resource that it would never be stopped. And then there's a group called Corporate Ethics International that created the tar sands campaign. That's what they called it. We call it oil sands. They called it tar sands. It started in 2008. And their framework was that they had done such a great job demonizing coal and defunding coal. Their next big target was going to be oil. And in particular, at that time, if you go back to 2008, America was far more reliant on both Saudi Arabia and Canada for oil. And so what they thought was, well, if we can cut off the supply of this essential fuel to the United States, then we'll be able to force a change in driving habits, a change in consumption behavior. Not very easy to do that in Saudi Arabia, kind of a dangerous place if you're going to be an activist. And so they targeted Canada and they started demonizing Canada. And it was a keep it in the ground coalition that really pummeled us for 10 or 15 years. The interesting thing, though, is that America ended up developing its own production. And so you would have thought that maybe they would have said, gee, this campaign was a bust and stopped doing it. But I think that sows the seeds for why Canada has been so targeted by the international environmental movement. Mark Carney is still a bit of a mystery to me. I always say that there's two Mark Carneys. There's a Mark Carney, the banker and advisor to conservative governments, which he was. He advised Stephen Harper's government, a conservative one, as well as conservative governments in the UK. And then there's the head of the Glasgow Net Zero Alliance that you just talked about, and his own book, Values, where he very much talks about a pretty hostile attitude toward oil and gas investment. I don't know which Mark Carney we have. I don't know if we've got the pragmatic banker or if we've got the environmental activist. We won't know that until we see some of the policy changes that he has. If I could maybe offer, there are certain business leaders who really are a technology agnostic and are looking towards what makes you the most money. And in the last 10 years, all the money was betting on wind, solar, batteries, electric vehicles, until the shakeup that's happened in the last couple of years. And that's when I think the recalibration occurred. And so is there a bit of an understanding now that you can't transition that quickly, that you're going to harm your own economy in trying to achieve these global aspirations? Maybe. I think one of the cases that I saw that was really compelling was when Shell was challenged at The Hague about wanting to produce more natural gas, and they successfully argued that by producing more natural gas, you reduce global emissions because it displaces higher emitting fuels. That those kinds of things, I think, have caused those who have been such staunch advocates and activists on this issue to say maybe there is another way. And that's what we're putting on the table as a province. We think there's another way to get to carbon neutrality. Our other way includes decarbonizing production by either having nuclear, small or large, hydroelectric, as well as carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and then also working on direct air capture for the last mile, having natural gas exports so that we can displace heavier emitting fuels, having hydrogen built out as an alternative for, I know that there are some who think that you can put everything on your electricity grid and that electric is the answer to everything. Well, you know what? Hydrogen might actually be an answer for heating, for electricity, and for transportation fuels. So I've taken an all of the above approach. That's what I've been advocating for the last 2.5 years. And I'm hopeful that being pragmatic, that making some of those arguments about how you can have emissions reduction, but there's a different way to do it, I'm hoping that that's having a breakthrough.
I was wondering, Premier Smith, in your all of the above thoughts there, you're also pro-growth, and one of the things that was coming out in the recent campaign is that Canada has lagged in growth relative to the other developed countries. What do you think about is the mindset in Canada? You have the energy tension, but there's also the tariff tension that's happening on both sides of the border. But is the mindset really shifting towards growth? Do you feel people leaning into that? And is that why we could be hopeful perhaps that Mark Carney, the pragmatic banker, is gonna show up because we just need more growth?
I certainly hope so. I did a previous interview where I was asked who some of my political heroes were, and we had a premier named Premier Ralph Klein back when I was just getting involved in politics, and his ideology was really shaped by the New Zealand Labour government. And Roger Douglas at the time he had a really great insight. He said, yeah, I've got a lot of things I want to spend money on, but I can't spend it until I make it first. And so his view was have a robust, strong economy that has relatively low tax or attractive tax rates, attractive regulatory environment, so you can generate the jobs and the wealth and government revenues to enable you to achieve your public policy goals. And I think we got that backwards in the last 10 years in Canada. We had a very high spending government that wanted to do all things for all people and spend a lot of money on social programs. And their view was just print money to do it. Well, I think now we realize that we're going back to something a little bit more traditional, that you've got to have that balance balance. You actually have to make the money before you spend it. That's what I'm hoping for, anyway. And I think that if that is the case, and everybody is suffering the same problem, the money printing problem has resulted in inflation around the world. It is eroding living standards in Canada, probably worse than any OECD country when you look at wage growth. And the thing that we have in Canada, which I think was well articulated earlier, was that we do have a resource-based economy. We do have oil and gas and critical minerals and uranium, electricity, and that is really a strength. And so if you think about the value that a major pipeline project would deliver to our country, when I look at the fact that we didn't get Keystone built, and we didn't get Northern Gateway built, and we didn't get Energy East built, that would have added 2.5 million barrels a day of production, which would be at today's prices about $55 billion of additional revenue that would be generated. That's about 15% of our GDP in Alberta right now. We'd be 15% wealthier if those three projects had gone ahead. So that's how I frame it out. And there really aren't very many other projects that have that kind of value proposition, aside from those really high value energy materials and critical minerals that I was just mentioning. So I hope that there has been some recognition that these are the items that the world wants. These are the items, of course, that our biggest trading partner, the United States, wants. This is where we have a natural advantage. This is where China has gone around the world and locked in the supply chain. We are the solution to so many countries and allies' problems when it comes to being able to access these resources. I hope that there is a little bit of a spirit of, we're in this together and we're a solution, and we've got to pull our weight when it comes to helping out our friends and allies. That may be the way that Canada can frame this out, because it does feel a little bit like Canada's been ashamed of the fact that we have had a resource-based economy, and I don't think we should be. I think that is our principal advantage, and I hope that we embrace it.
Do you think it's interesting? We were reading a little bit of Mark Carney's book and talking about this coming into the discussion, but if you were just, getting up in the morning and thinking about what's best for Canada, you would be very pro-energy, pro all of the above, pro-oil and gas, just like your positions. But if you were attending global meetings where you're getting judged by your peers on who's doing the most to address climate and some of that, if you got into that type of discussion, it seems like that's the path to making some of the choices that ended up hurting Canada, hurting other countries, hurting other producing countries. Do you have a perspective on sort of politicians who are advocating for what's best for their nation versus those that are getting pulled into these global conversations, which they may be well intended, but they're very distracting and they could ultimately hurt their own constituents? I know that's a weird question, but I'm just trying to understand kind of the motivation of some of these other leaders.
Well, you've really tapped into the Canadian psyche with that question, because even though the Americans are clearly our best friends and closest trading partner, we do have an historic alliance with European nations, in particular UK, because we still share a monarch. We also have France, which is a very strong connection with Quebec. And so I think Canada is very heavily influenced by the discussion and politics of what's happening in the United Kingdom and France. And we've seen this, that in the UK, they've turned away from energy production. And in France, they're mostly nuclear. And so they also have a bit of a clean energy perspective. But you have to look at your own nation and your own geography and your own reality. You can't say, oh, we can be just like the UK. We can't. Or we can be just like European Union. We can't. What we should be looking at is what our natural strengths are. And this is also maybe a bit of a cleavage that we have in our country, is that if you are in Ontario, further east, your orientation is towards Europe. If you're in Manitoba and west, your orientation is towards Asia. And Asia wants very different things than Europe does. I can see how Europe is moving towards attempting to have more and more non-renewable or more and more renewable sources for their energy. But Asia is trying to get off coal. And if we can't help them get off coal, we're just going to see an increase in emissions. So I think there's two conversations happening here. And you're quite right. Those multilateral bodies that have a very particular type of consensus that comes out of it isn't necessarily very practical from a Canadian point of view. What I observed with the previous Prime Minister is that he seemed to think he had to gainsay whatever the most aggressive target was that anybody put on the table. It's, oh, well, you want to be 2050? I'll see you and raise you. I'm going to get to 2030. And he didn't really have a lens of whether or not that was even practical or possible, or the harm it would cause in the meantime. So that's why I would say that even though I think Prime Minister Carney clearly shares the same aspirations on emissions reduction, I would hope that, having been both embedded in the government here as well as the UK, he could identify the differences, and that he would be able to see that a slower pathway to get there might be one that is a way to accommodate everybody's interests. Again, I live in hope, but I have seen that there has been a very strident and extremist view on this that has seized the world for about 10 years. And I don't know if everybody is fully shaken into the reality. I mean, I have. I meet as intergovernmental and international relations minister as well. I have that as my portfolio. I meet with a lot of international ambassadors, and they all come here and say, we would like to find a way to buy more of your oil and gas. So whatever agreements it is that they're signing on to on these multilateral sessions that they get together on, they understand that if they're not getting it from us, they're getting it from Russia or Iran or some of the other less reliable producers around the world. And I think they'd rather get it from us. And so I think that conversation is changing, but there may still need to be a few more proof points before we start seeing some different decisions coming out of those multilateral bodies.
So one thing, maybe just to build on that, one thing I think we sense in the U.S. is that U.S. lower 48 players are starting to think about where else they might go in the world. And Canada, for resource potential and cultural reasons and proximity, it just sticks out. Do you run into U.S. companies who come to visit you and talk about the potential for doing more things in Canada, try to get some comfort from you? Like, what do you sense about more American companies coming over, and perhaps why they should pursue those ideas because of all the good reasons we're talking about?
I see it certainly on the discussion around data centers, but I would say historically our industry developed in large part because of capital and expertise that was shared between Canada and the United States. But I think one of the consequences of what happened with the turn against our energy sector in the last 15 years is that American companies thought, oh, well, the easiest way for me to green my balance sheet would be to reduce my heavy oil assets. And so many of them cashed out of Canada. And I think that that's been such a shame, because now we don't have the same strong voices as advocates in the American political system that we once had. The same thing, you've probably seen that there's a number of different pipeline development projects, and I was encouraged to see the president say he'd like to see some kind of reboot of the Keystone XL pipeline. But I think everybody is looking at it pragmatically, saying, okay, well, we'll build it up to the border, and then maybe it should be an American pipeline company that takes it from there, because that again might end up having more political power in the United States. If it's an American company with American workers and American voices doing American lobbying, then maybe that's the way that we mitigate our risk as well. And so I think that might be just the new world that we find ourselves in. But I'm encouraged to see that there's at least 1.5 to 2 million barrels a day of pipeline projects being talked about going to the United States. I hope some of those manage to go ahead. And that's how I think the relationship will develop, that it will probably have some kind of joint venture partnerships between pipeline companies. Maybe that will encourage some American companies to come back into Canada and invest in the heavy oil assets, but maybe not. And if not, that's okay too, because where we have found advocates for Canadian oil has been among the refineries. There are several refineries that receive either the lion's share or 100% of their oil from Canada. And they're tooled to receive a particular brand of oil. There's not very many great replacements for it, as I mentioned, Iran or Venezuela, perhaps. And so I think that we do have a number of advocates who've made that case to the administration quite successfully. And I think that would be really positive. I don't look at our heavy oil as being competitive to the United States. I feel like WTI and Western Canada Select fill different market niches. And I think that together, if we were both working on Canada backfilling into the US to keep prices low for American consumers, allowing Americans to export more of their product internationally to achieve some of their security goals and energy dominance goals, I think that's a pretty good partnership to have. And then if we can fill with our West Coast pipeline, like Trans Mountain and maybe another, fill some of the Asian markets that are currently relying on some of the less reliable suppliers. I think that also lends itself to a really good partnership with the U.S. So the conversation's changed a bit than what it might have been 10 or 15 years ago, but I still think that there's a lot of reason to support that integration.
It seems like from a tactical standpoint, even sort of putting energy aside for a minute, if Mark Carney, if you're trying to negotiate with Trump on tariffs, you're trying to say that, we Canada are going to try to go get more markets. One of the best things you could do would be to, as quickly as possible, approve more pipelines to get oil and gas out of Canada and into Asia, getting better prices, bucking up Canada, getting strength back, just to almost as a negotiating tool. Is it get talked about quite like that up there? It seems like that would be a good move to make, just in terms of negotiations, honestly.
I see you see my strategy. That's exactly what I'm trying to do. Is look, I would love to build pipelines northeast, southwest. I know that probably the easiest pathway, especially with the current administration, might be to build south. But we also know that has disadvantaged us as a jurisdiction in the past. Before we had another market with Trans Mountain, we ended up from time to time with some major bottlenecks in the pipeline system, and the differential got blown out. I think that there were times when our oil was selling at a discount of up to $30 US lower than WTI. Now that we have Trans Mountain and a different market and it's calibrated the market differently, I think that differential is down to $10. And so that's good for us. And it's made the proof point about why we need to have more than one customer. And so it should make the point to the Americans about why it is they should also want to continue to have us selling to the US, because it is a discounted product that does keep prices low. But I would say that it benefits us to do both. If it is the case, and OPEC is right, that we are growing to 125 million barrels, and we do have a decline rate, it does make sense for us to build new pipelines so that we can perhaps bring another million barrels a day to the Asian markets. That's what I'm proposing. Is I'd like to see a bitumen pipeline to our west coast that would be Port of Prince Rupert, or in that area where we could export another million barrels a day. And perhaps there's also room for us to increase to the US 1.5 to 2 million barrels a day and provide that certainty. I haven't seen very good projections. Maybe you guys can educate me about what the projections are for US oil production going out the next 10 or 20 years. I think we're looking at Canada. If I get all of the projects I want built, we could potentially grow to I've been putting it out there that I'd love to double our production. So let's put it around 7 million barrels a day. And so we'd still be far less than what Americans are producing right now. But that to me, if in a world where we're seeing an increased demand, I think that both Canada and the US should aspire to be a larger part of it. I just think that's good for the planet to have reliable suppliers like both Canada and the US.
Premier, back in late April, I think there was an open letter to Mark Carney, from a lot of these producers, like 5 priorities that have to be put in place immediately. I guess question number one, where is that? And question number two, obviously tariffs are the big item right now, but if we're starting to look at like guideposts from Mark Carney, say 3, 6, 9 months, a year from now, what are the timelines? What are the key events that we need to be focused on to say he's been a really successful, sort of prime minister or not?
Well, some of this gets into a little bit of detail about what it is that we need to fix here, because it's so different than the American marketplace. But I mean, to give you an idea of why this no new pipelines law is so problematic, some of the things in there, they wanted you to put it through a sort of a woke lens of whether it would have impacts on intersectionality and women's rights to have a man camp. I mean, how in the world are you supposed to meet your regulatory obligations? How do you get to yes if it's going to be that subjective? So that's got to go. I mean, a tanker ban, like what's the point of building to the coast if you're not allowed to put anything on the boat? That's another one. The emissions cap, as I mentioned, the previous government floated an emissions cap that was so aggressive, it would mean we would have to shut in 2 million barrels a day by 2030 in order to be able to achieve it. We still have net zero power regs, as I mentioned. We would have our executives going to jail by 2035 if they had natural gas plants that were not 95% abated. The current technology is only about 70%. And we still have net zero vehicle regulations. As of January, Albertans are supposed to buy 20% of their cars that are zero emissions vehicles. Well, we don't even produce that many in Canada. And so we would end up having to start queuing up for diesel and gasoline powered vehicles because there's only a limit to how much can be sold. And then the one that's there's others like this, they've declared plastic toxic. And so if you have to then manage plastic as if it's hazardous material, you can imagine all of the extra provisions. And we've got so much cross-border traffic that happens in plastics. Actually, Pete Sessions has been one of the most vocal advocates on saying how ludicrous that one was. And we also have a greenwashing bill that says that if you state your environmental emissions reduction performance, that can be characterized as greenwashing. And again, criminal sanction, going to jail for misleading the public. So you see what I mean? Like I have 9 of these policies that are very much like all of those of the same kind and just as ludicrous that have to go if we're going to signal that we're moving in a different direction. The CEOs, they zeroed in on the 5 that were the most obscene to them, but they're very much in sync with where we are. And I'm glad to see that we've got the CEOs finding their voice. For a long time, they didn't. For a long time, I think it was the advocacy groups that were controlling the public debate. And then it was some politicians who were trying to carry it, but they were certainly in the minority. Now I feel like everybody, including the Canadian public, are saying we got to get a grip. We can't be going down this pathway anymore. So I'm very pleased that everybody is saying the same thing, because it makes it harder for the government to say that it's just that premier in Alberta. She just doesn't get it. It's if everybody is saying it, then it's maybe there's something to it. So I'm looking at the fall. Our legislative sessions are a little bit different than yours, but we take long breaks over the summer, and then the session goes back in on September the 15th. That's plenty of time to rewrite laws. I've written enough laws in the time that I've been in government. I know that you can redraft or repeal or write language to correct all of the 9 bad laws, and we'll see how much of that gets addressed in the fall session. If it doesn't, then what I would worry about is that the Prime Minister would be thinking that he could just do the minimum possible to get certain projects approved, and then that's it. And I don't think that would send a great message to the market, because if you're a big company that has a multi-billion-dollar project and you can get on the project list, great. But what happens to the 10 and 50 and $100 million proposal? Those all need to go forward too. And if we don't repair the investment climate, that's not going to allow for much fairness when it comes to all of the great projects that entrepreneurs and business leaders might put forward. So I think it's a time limited. I think it's before the end of the year that we need to see some real action.
Premier Smith, we've spent a lot of time rightfully talking about the oil opportunities. I love your target of doubling Canadian oil production. I share that objective, and I think that is something to be pursued. You talked about bringing AI data centers to Canada, which makes sense. I think the third area is LNG, and I'm struck that 10 years ago, the U.S. had almost no LNG exports, and now within such a short period of time, we're larger than Qatar or Australia to be the #1 LNG exporter. When I look at Canadian gas, it's even more substantial, or at least as substantial as the US. It's sort of more stranded, if you will, in terms of not having a domestic opportunity. But I think in this case, while I know the federal government's important, so is, I believe, please correct me if I'm wrong, the province of British Columbia, where you're going to have to ship through that. You're going to have to, at least in the US Gulf Coast, we have some established industrial centers where you're building this, but we have a lot of companies competing, and it's a miracle. It's amazing how quickly it's happened. Canada can have the same thing. I'm not going to ask you how to fix British Columbia. That's probably not an appropriate question, but what can be done? There's absolutely no reason Canada shouldn't be exporting LNG, including using AI for gas for data centers and that kind of stuff. You all should be at least as large as we are. How do you make that happen?
Well, I'm pleased to report that BC has fixed itself in the intervening years, that even with an NDP government, which is a more of a socialist government, they have come to the conclusion that in order for them to generate the revenues they need to develop this substantial resource. And so we had our very first shipment of LNG from LNG Canada out of Kitimat, just I think in the last couple of weeks. And we have at least 3 other projects that are well advanced and will likely go ahead. In Nova Scotia, they've taken the ban off of fracking. So Nova Scotia also has significant offshore natural gas resources. So they may well also develop a natural gas industry. And I am working hard on Quebec because Quebec also has substantial natural gas resources. And if we can get them to agree to either add that to the grid or even just look at a development for LNG export to Europe, which would make a lot of sense, then you would have multiple regions in the country that are able to develop their gas resources. So I feel like there has been a shift in understanding the role that natural gas would play. And maybe it's because you have to build the infrastructure out, the pipeline infrastructure, and it can be repurposed. Maybe you can blend hydrogen into it as well, or maybe ultimately repurpose them to hydrogen. Maybe you'll be able to transport biofuels as well. Maybe there has been some thinking that infrastructure is infrastructure. And if it makes sense today to build out LNG, maybe it can be repurposed in the future. If that's the thinking, that's fine. But I tend to look at natural gas not just as a transition fuel. I look at it as a destination fuel as well, because it does have such attractive profile and cost as well. But I would say that we're on the cusp. We're 10 years behind, but we're on the cusp. One of the other things I'm looking at is how can we do a better job of connecting into the American pipeline network for gas so that it isn't stranded here and we aren't just having to look at going through BC. At the moment, I mean, we've had a blowout of our gas prices in the past, again, because of plumbing problems where we have too much gas coming through Alberta going into the United States. But now that the Americans have such a great outlet, if we can build some of those networks out, that might also give us an opportunity for BC and Alberta gas to find a different export opportunity as well. So I think that that's another market that really should be looking at integration. I think that it isn't competitive. Again, it just by having us able to backfill keeps American prices low, but it also allows the Americans to export more. It really is a really perfect partnership. We've done it for years. I think we've got some 70 pipelines that go cross border. So there's no reason why we can't be looking at doing that as well.
Well, Premier Smith, you've been so generous with your time, and this was one of those discussions I think we all knew the minute it started. We were just like, oh no, it's going to end at some point. You've been such an outspoken proponent of all of the above, of U.S. Canada partnership, U.S. Canada trade, U.S. Canada energy integration. What can we do to be helpful to you? We'd love to host you down here to help you spread your message, but let me just ask here at the end, how can we help your efforts?
Well, what I would say is that when I look at trade agreements, the trade agreements are not for countries. Trade agreements are so that businesses can do business. And so the faster that Canada and the United States can settle their trade agreements so everybody knows the rules of the game, then the faster we can get on to talking about all the great partnerships that will develop out of that. I really hope that we don't miss this opportunity. I think that when the president came in and was clearly making a shift towards energy, I thought that that was a real opportunity for us to partner and to really support that aspiration of energy dominance. But everything's been stalled as we've been in the middle of this tariff fight. So anything you can do to lend your voice to trying to get that Canada-U.S. free trade agreement resolved early, I think that benefits investors on both sides of the border.
We'll say, let's knock out this deal and then let's get back to partnering.
Let's absolutely do that. Awesome.
Premier Smith, fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. We'll talk to you again.
Thanks, everybody.